So I have a couple other questions here, and
Yeah.
they're sort of related to certifications and also
Okay.
the intersection of project management and agile, with which I think
Huh.
you understand that that intersection has grown significantly over the past
The
couple of years.
intersection.
Have you look? Would you like to expand on that a little bit? Looks like you have some thoughts.
The intersection of right. Oh, you're pushing buttons there, aren't you? um, Project management hasn't really changed. At the end of the, I tell people that I can teach you project management in 20 seconds, which probably scares you to death, considering we're talking about project management, all these courses. Um, but basically, project management, work out what you want to plan to do it and finish. So you can do something at home. You're going to go shopping, you plan, you work out, I've got to go shopping because you go and do the shopping, you come back and you finish, job done. But it's the element, it's the area that you're working in. It's got to change, or you got to understand. And there's a variable. So most project management courses say, when you're in this situation, this is what you need to think about, right? So it's and usually it's because other things are happening. I'm again without going boring you with the history of whatever agile, etc. But what happened was in the around the 80s, the businesses started to drift away from wanting to be involved in their capability, building new capabilities. Remember, I'm using the word capability now rather than output, deliverable, or whatever. They business said we need this capability, but they were focusing on expanding because the globalization was coming in. The problem was is that when project management was documented, the first time it was about 1974, which was Prince 2, and 81 was around PMP. Basically what happened was they documented it as though they were building a house because that's what the business understood. At that time, they were talking about the linear approach, which everybody now thinks is called waterfall, although it was never called a waterfall approach, it was linear. And they talked about iterations, but the businesses didn't really get that. So they said, right, we understand the sequence. But what happened was in the 80s, we started moving to a situation where the the guys now writing solutions, which is now becoming computer driven or IT driven, had to work in a different way because the demands on their time and was being driven the deadlines by the business. So they had to invent ways of working. So what you did, you created a way to work to fit into that business environment. Then as we got to the 2000s, the Y2K came along. Businesses stopped doing innovation because they thought of survival. Because the aircraft were going to fall out of the sky and all sorts of things were going to go crazy because of Y2K, because it never happened. Well, Y2K did, but the problems weren't going to be there. When they got out the other side and they all went, these 17 guys went up a mountain to talk about how to develop software, they said, what are the problems in projects? And the 12 principles came out, which said, look, we want to embrace change even late in the project, which meant tell us if you want to change rather than wait for us to deliver and then say you don't want it. Business people and developers work together. Why? Because we want business people to start committing again. So all these 12 principles were simply there to help the project manager, we'll call it the project manager, to say they always have problems because the demand is the project manager does this, but we got to help him. The way we got through the Y2K was this is what we're going to do. And then 2 years later, they said, well, we can now apply agile to project management. But if you look at it, for example, the question I'll say is that if you take Scrum, for example, which is just one approach, and agile is an approach, it's not a method. Because I can say, if you go to Scrum and say, well, who owns the business case? A lot of people will say the product owner. That's not right because it doesn't say that. The product owner is the person in the team that actually understands the functionality. They're not the person who's like the sponsor. So over the last, so we got to a point where if you go to a business and say it's better, it's cheaper, it's faster, why are you going to say no? But if you link it to software, it makes sense. So faster means you're not going to do stuff you don't need. cheaper you're not doing that work, so therefore it's cheaper overall and better because you actually are being allowed to do testing, so you can't compromise testing, because that was always the problem. To get it done on time, people cut testing. So when they went down the agile over the last 20 years, business agility, I mean, it then became like the marketing element. Let's all go down business agility, which is great, but you still got to have the wrapper around it. For example, the business doesn't care what you do to build the product. So you've got to understand the environment, and I call it the wrapper. For example, this is something I'll say when I'm doing, and I cover agile as well. If I'm doing Scrum, if that's what they want. Now, Scrum we know is a framework. So on day one of sprint one, the team's got to be productive. In which sprint you create the initial backlog, and I get silence. They say, well, sprint one. No, it's not. It's beforehand. So that's why sprint zero. That's why Scrum Alliance and Scrum all got a bit of a falling out. But basically, you say, right, what else happens before you get there? And people start to think, well, you've got to put a team together. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. We've got to have some kind of business case to justify the work. We've got to have some kind of idea of how long it's going to take. Otherwise, you do a bit of planning. And when you look at it, you create this project management, as I call it, wrapper, that allows the development team to then build. So when you talk about the intersection, it's I can run a project where some of it I have to do in a very, and I'll call it traditional. Those are things are traditional, where we have to do things in a certain sequence, where we've got external factors. But then we've actually got an element which is very dynamic.